All right, you guys, I am here behind the elementary building and I'm starting to build a brand new garden. We got a whole bunch of lumber delivered. We got a whole bunch of compost soil delivered. And I want to talk to you today about raised beds. If you're just getting started with gardening, or if you live somewhere where you don't have a lot of yard space, it totally makes sense to plant in pots, milk crates, recycling bins, 5-gallon buckets, whatever kind of planters you can find to plant in. It's great to find creative ways to grow food in small spaces. But if you have a little bit more space and you're starting to take this a little bit more seriously, I highly recommend growing in raised beds. So what are raised beds? It's pretty much what it sounds like. A raised bed is an area that you plant in that is raised above the level of the ground. And there's a few key reasons why raised beds are a good idea. Well, here's a good example. If you see here, there's a drain here. And this garden area, it all slopes downward. So this is a very low spot that tends to get very wet. If your garden is too wet, your plants might not grow so well. So one thing that raised beds help to do is with drainage. It helps to ensure that that soil doesn't stay too soggy. Now, you could do what they do on most farms, which they don't have boxes like this, some kind of frame that's framing in the soil and holding it in. It would just be a mound of soil on the ground. And that can also be a raised bed if you don't walk on it and if it's a permanent bed that's separate from the walkways. But if you want order and if you want things to look very neat and clean, having some kind of frame or border around your beds can really help make a clear separation between your growing spaces and your walking paths. But with that said, if you have a big garden space and you just want to mound up some soil to make some raised beds that way, it takes less resources, it's cheaper, you can get going quicker and easily, and that's how we do it on farms. However, another benefit of having raised beds like these is that it holds in the soil. You won't lose soil to erosion as the rain comes, because one of the great things about raised beds is you can fill it with really high quality soil. So you can see back there, we've got a huge pile of Black Earth Compost, a great local company that makes high quality soil. And you can add other things to your raised beds like azomite, which is volcanic minerals to remineralize your soil. You can add worm castings, which is a very nutrient dense way to inoculate your soil. Another thing is that if your beds are high enough, that can also help to keep out rabbits and other animals that might eat some of your plants. So typically your beds would have to be about 2 feet tall to keep out the rabbits. Otherwise, if rabbits are an issue, you'll have to put up a little garden fence. Raised beds can be very simple, or they can be a bit more finished looking, like having this type of sill on there. Or here's another bed that I recently built for a family in Wellesley that's just starting to grow their own food. Here's a raised bed that we just made do with some logs and some rocks and some bricks with some perennial herbs growing in there. There's one reason I want to tell you that might be the best reason to have raised beds. And this has to do with the fact that you have a permanent separation between your growing spaces and your walking paths. And what that does is helps to ensure that you don't walk on your beds. Because if you walk on your beds, then it compacts the soil. And that can negatively affect all of the life in your soil and can negatively affect how your plants grow. So in farms or gardens that don't have raised beds, they typically make new beds every growing cycle. And in between, they do a lot of tilling. So you would come through with either a rototiller in a small garden or larger implements on a tractor on a larger garden or farm, and they would till the soil and tear up the earth. Now there's a lot of concern that that negatively affects the soil structure, because the soil has developed a natural structure to it connected with billions of microorganisms and bacteria and whole networks of fungi called mycelium. And there's a lot of science out there now showing how important it is to not disturb the soil. And so if we have raised beds, we can really develop and build healthy soil. And over the years, by adding more compost and more minerals, then the soil should improve over time. All right, so a raised bed can really be any size you want, any width, any depth, and even any length. These beds that I'm starting to build here now are 20 feet long and they're 3 feet wide this way. A standard raised bed size that you'll see around might be 4 feet wide by 8 feet long. And that totally works. Although you want to think about how you're going to access the bed all the way around. So if it's 4 feet wide, it can be a real stretch and not so comfortable to reach from one side all the way to the other side of the 4-foot width. So sometimes going a little bit narrow might make it more comfortable to work in the middle of the bed. These beds are 3 feet. You could even go narrower or wider. It's whatever works for your space and your comfort level. Now these are more utilitarian beds. We're going to build a lot of them here just to give us a lot of growing space. So they're not going to be nicely finished with caps. They're just going to be these long boxes like this. And these are 2 by 12. So that gives us just about 12 inches of raised bed height. And these will all be surrounded with a fence to help keep out the animals. So I just finished making this first bed. You can see what I did here. There are 2 10-foot boards running the whole length, and then there's this cross member in the middle, and that's to tie it all together. Now typically, even if I had a 20-foot board, oh, there's a snake. I feel like I'm in the Garden of Eden, but don't worry, I'm not being tempted by the snake. He's just an innocent little creature doing his thing. All right, that was cool. Always got to stop to appreciate nature and see the wildlife. There's a little gardener snake. So even if this was 1 full-length board, anytime you're going over 8 feet in length, you want to have some sort of cross member, because that will help to prevent the bed from bowing out from the pressure of the soil over time. You can use different types of materials. This is Douglas fir. Douglas fir lumber is pretty common to find. Sometimes you have to look a little bit. It's a pretty cheap lumber, but it's pretty strong, and this could be expected to last maybe 5 to 10 years before you have to start replacing boards, and it totally depends on your conditions. You can do other things to make these boards last longer, like you could put some sort of plastic liner on the inside if you're comfortable with the plastic. Some people will build their raised beds out of pressure treated wood, which should last a good 15 to 20 years at least. Again, depends on your comfort level and your research. Pressure treated wood is against organic standards, not that you have to worry about being certified organic. But still, you should be aware that pressure treated wood is treated with different types of chemicals. They say it's not treated with arsenic like it used to be, so it might not be as bad, but there still might be some concerns. So you can do your own research on that. Other options would be using cedar. Sometimes you can find what's called a knotty cedar, which is kind of like a lower grade cedar. So it's not as expensive, but it still tends to be really expensive. If you live somewhere more rural, sometimes you can look on Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist. You can find some local people who have a local portable sawmill, and they mill stuff themselves. Sometimes you can get some rough cut lumber that way. Otherwise, if you're just relying on the big lumber stores, if you can find Douglas fir for something cheap, that's better than using pine or spruce. It's a little bit stronger, will last a little bit longer, but if you want to spend the money and really invest, you can do cedar. If you're on the West Coast, you can do redwood. Those are woods that will last at least a good 15 to 20 years, like pressure treated, but they're completely natural, rot resistant, but you pay for it. Other options that are also very expensive, but will last for probably forever, is stone, right? You can build your raised beds out of bluestone, actually slabs of bluestone, kind of what they use to make steps out of. And you can use bluestone on edge, or you can use granite, like granite curbing. Now again, really expensive, but will last forever. You can also use bricks or masonry blocks, like man-made kind of concrete blocks that you can find at the big box stores. And some people are also concerned about growing in those, that there might be some leaching of undesirable compounds or chemicals. But again, you got to do your own research and decide what makes sense for you. The last thing I want to leave you with is that I think it's best to grow in any of those types of materials rather than not growing at all. So let's build some beds. If you're having a hard time drilling in some screws, or if you're splitting some wood, definitely pre-drill. Just make sure you use a drill bit that's a little bit narrower than your screw. All right, there's one of our end pieces. Now we gotta trim our 10-footers to length. Sharp pencils are very important for making accurate markings. If you're working with lumber wider than a 2x6, it's helpful to have a framing square rather than a speed square, but they're both good to have on hand. And don't forget, measure twice, cut once. Unless you have a wood stretcher, but I don't know if they exist. Feet. 10 feet, we're on. It's good to look at your wood to see if it has a cup in it, because if it's cupping, you want the cup facing inward. So as the soil pressure pushes on it, it will push back on the opposite way. All right, so I've got everything cut, the 2 end pieces, the cross member, and all 4 sideboards. Now I'm gonna measure off of this bed because this bed is already placed exactly where it needs to be in reference to the fence line that's going to go in later. And so I know after this 3-foot bed, I'm gonna want a 3-foot walking path. Most of the beds are only gonna have 2 feet walking paths, but I wanna make sure there's at least 1 or 2 access points where I can take a wheelbarrow all the way through. I need to add compost to the beds or to get the wheelbarrow in to clear stuff out of the beds. So we're gonna have a 3-foot path going this way and a 3-foot path on the perimeter here. But all the other walking paths will be 2 feet. Now we just want to check them for square. So that's what I have to say about raised beds and a little snippet of how to build some basic raised beds. So let me know if you're building some beds. Maybe you have some. Let me know how they're doing. I want to know. Peace and plants, everybody. Happy growing.